Chapter 19. Avery, of Bayouiage peculiarity of dwellings Epps builds a new house base, the carpenter his noble qualities his pfe. Sonolapia ed and eccentricities base and Epps discuss the question of slavey Epps opinion of base 1 make myself known to HTM our conversation his surprise the midnight meeting on the Bayou Bank base assurances declares war against slavery why I did not disclose my history base writes letters copy of his letter to Messrs. Pikey and Peary the fever of suspense disappointments base endeavors to cheer me my faith in him. In the month of June, 1852, in pursuance of a previous contract, Mr. Avery, a carpenter of Bayou Rouge, commenced the erection of a house for Master Epps. It has previously been stated that there are no cellars on Bayou Boeuf. On the other hand, such is the low and swampy nature of the ground, the great houses are usually built upon spiles. Another peculiarity is, the rooms are not plastered, but the ceiling and sides are covered with matched cypress boards, painted such color as most pleases the owner's taste. Generally the plank and boards are sawed by slaves with whipsaws, there being no water power upon which mills might be built within many miles. When the planter erects for himself a dwelling, therefore, there is plenty of extra work for his 264-12 YEAK9 slate. Slaves. Having had some experience under Tibeats as a carpenter, I was taken from the field altogether, on the arrival of Avery in his hands. Among them was one to whom I owe an immeasurable debt of gratitude. Only for him, in all probability, I should have ended my days in slavery. He was my deliverer, a man whose true heart overflowed with noble and generous emotions. To the last moment of my existence I shall remember him with feelings of thankfulness. His name was Bass, and at that time he resided in Marksville. It will be difficult to convey a correct impression of his appearance or character. He was a large man, between 40 and 50 years old, of light complexion and light hair. He was very cool and self-possessed, fond of argument, but always speaking with extreme deliberation. He was that kind of person whose peculiarity of manner was such that nothing he uttered ever gave offense. What would be intolerable, coming from the lips of another, could be said by him with impunity. There was not a man on Red River, perhaps, that agreed with him on the subject of politics or religion, and not a man, I venture to say, who discussed either of those subjects half as much. It seemed to be taken for granted that he would espouse the unpopular side of every local question, and it always created amusement rather than displeasure among his auditors, to listen to the ingenious and original manner in which he maintained the controversy. He was a bachelor, an old bachelor, A.C. Bass, the Cookpentek. 265. According to the true acceptation of the term, having no kindred living, as he knew of, in the world. Either had he any permanent abiding place wandering from one state to another, as his fancy dictated. He had lived in Marksville 3 or 4 years, and in the prosecution of his business as a carpenter, and in consequence, likewise, of his peculiarities, was quite extensively known throughout the parish of Avoyles. He was liberal to a fault, and his many acts of kindness and transparent goodness of heart rendered him popular in the community, the sentiment of which he unceasingly combated. He was a native of Canada, from whence he had wandered in early life, and after visiting all the principal localities in the northern and western states, in the course of his peregrinations, arrived in the unhealthy region of the Red River. His last removal was Ferney, Illinois. Whither he has now gone, I regret to be obliged to say, is unknown to me. He gathered up his effects and departed quietly from Marksville the day before I did, the suspicions of his instrumentality in procuring my liberation rendering such a step necessary. For the commission of a just and righteous act he would undoubtedly have suffered death, had he remained within reach of the slave-whipping tribe on Bayou Boeuf. One day, while working on the new house, Bass and Epps became engaged in a controversy, to which, as will be readily supposed, I listened with absorbing interest. They were discussing the subject of slavery. 266 12 years a slate. I tell you what it is, Epps, said Bass, it's all wrong, sir, there's no justice nor righteousness in it. I wouldn't own a slave if I was rich as Croesus, which I am not, as is perfectly well understood, more particularly among my creditors. There's another humbug, the credit system humbug, sir, no credit no debt. Credit leads a man into temptation. Cash down is the only thing that will deliver him from evil. But this question of slavery, what right have you to your niggers when you come down to the point? What right, said Epps, laughing, why, I bought M, and paid for M. Of course you did. The law says you have the right to hold a nigger, but begging the law's pardon, it lies. Yes, Epps, when the law says that it's a liar, and the truth is not in it. Is everything right because the law allows it? Suppose they'd pass a law taking away your liberty and making you a slave. Oh, that ain't a supposable case, said Epps, still laughing. Hope you don't compare me to a nigger, Base. Well, Base answered gravely, no, not exactly. But I have seen niggers before now as good as I am, and I have no acquaintance with any white man in these parts that I consider a whit better than myself. Now, in the sight of God, what is the difference, Epps? Between a white man and a black one? All the difference in the world, replied Epps. You might as well ask what the differences be. Discussion on slavery. 267. Tween a white man and a baboon. Now, I've seen one of them critters in Orleans that knowed just as much as any nigger I've got. Yond call them feller citizens, I suppose percent and Epps indulged in a loud laugh at his own wit. Look here, Epps, continued his companion, you can't laugh me down in that way. Some men are witty, and some ain't so witty as they think they are. Now let me ask you a question. Are all men created free and equal as the Declaration of Independence holds they are? Yes, responded Epps, but all men, niggers, and monkeys ain't, and hereupon he broke forth into a more boisterous laugh than before. There are monkeys among white people as well as black, when you come to that, coolly remarked Base. I know some white men that use arguments no sensible monkey would. But let that pass. These niggers are human beings. If they don't know as much as their masters, whose fault is it? They are not allowed to know anything. You have books and papers, and can go where you please, and gather intelligence in 1,000 ways. But your slaves have no privileges. You'd whip one of them if caught reading a book. They are held in bondage, generation after generation, deprived of mental improvement, and who can expect them to possess much knowledge? If they are not brought down to a level with the brute creation, you slaveholders will never be blamed for it. If they are baboons, or stand no. 268 12 Ya is a slave. Higher in the scale of intelligence than such animals, young and men like you will have to answer for it. There's a sin, a fearful sin, resting on this nation, Ty will not go unpunished forever. There will be a reckoning yet, yes, Epps, there's a clay coming that will burn as an oven. It may be sooner or it may be later, but it's a coming as sure as the Lord is just. If you lived up among the Yankees in New England, said EJ3PS, I expect you'd be one of them cursed fanatics that know more than the Constitution, and go about peddling clocks and coaxing niggers to run away. If I was in New England, returned Base, I would be just what I am here. I would say that slavery was an iniquity, and ought to be abolished. I would say there was no reason nor justice in the law, or the Constitution that allows one man to hold another man in bondage. It would be hard for you to lose your property, to be sure, but it wouldn't be half as hard as it would be to lose your liberty. You have no more right to your freedom, in exact justice, than Uncle Abram yonder. Talk about black skin, and black blood, why, how many slaves are there on this bayou as white as either of us? And what difference is there in the color of the soul? Pshaw! The whole system is as absurd as it is cruel. You may own niggers and be hanged, but I wouldn't own one for the best plantation in Louisiana. You like to hear yourself talk, Base, better than any man I know of. You would argue that black was. Conversation with Base. 269. White, or white-black, if anybody would contradict you. Nothing suits you in this world, and I don't believe you will be satisfied with the next, if you should have your choice in them. Conversations substantially like the foregoing were not unusual between the two after this, Epps drawing him out more for the purpose of creating a laugh at his expense, than with a view of fairly discussing the merits of the question. He looked upon Base, as a man ready to say anything merely for the pleasure of hearing his own voice, as somewhat self-conceited, perhaps, contending against his faith and judgment, in order, simply, to exhibit his dexterity in argumentation. He remained at Epps through the summer, visiting Marksville generally once a fortnight. The more I saw of him, the more I became convinced he was a man in whom I could confide. Nevertheless, my previous ill fortune had taught me to be extremely cautious. It was not my place to speak to a white man except when spoken to, but I omitted no opportunity of throwing myself in his way, and endeavored constantly in every possible manner to attract his attention. In the early part of August he and myself were at work alone in the house, the other carpenters having left, and Epps being absent in the field. Now was the time, if ever, to broach the subject, and I resolved to do it, and submit to whatever consequences might ensue. We were busily at work in the afternoon, when I stopped suddenly and said, 270-12 takes a slave. Master Base, I want to ask you what part of the country you came from. Why, Piot, what put that into your head? He answered. You wouldn't know if I should tell you. After a moment or two he added, I was born in Canada, now guess where that is. Oh, I know where Canada is, said I have been there myself. Yes, I expect you are well acquainted all through that country, he remarked, laughing incredulously. As sure as I live, Master Base, I replied, I have been there. I have been in Montreal and Kingston, and Queenston, and a great many places in Canada, and I have been in York State, too, in Buffalo, and Rochester, and Albany, and can tell you the names of the villages on the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal. Base turned round and gazed at me a long time without uttering a syllable. How came you here? He inquired, at length. Master Base, I answered, if justice had been done, I never would have been here. Well, how's this? Said he. Who are you? You have been in Canada sure enough, I know all the places you mention. How did you happen to get here? Come, tell me all about it. I have no friends here, was my reply, that I can put confidence in. I am afraid to tell you, though I don't believe you would tell Master Epps if I should. Base assurances. 271. He assured me earnestly he would keep every word I might speak to him a profound secret, and his curiosity was evidently strongly excited. It was a long story, I informed him, and would take some time to relate it. Master Epps would be back soon, but if he would see me that night after all were asleep, I would repeat it to him. He consented readily to the arrangement, and directed me to come into the building where we were then at work, and I would find him there. About midnight, when all was still and quiet, I crept cautiously from my cabin, and silently entering the unfinished building, found him awaiting me. After further assurances on his part that I should not be betrayed, I began a relation of the history of my life and misfortunes. He was deeply interested, asking numerous questions in reference to localities and events. Having ended my story, I besought him to write to some of my friends at the North, acquainting them with my situation, and begging them to forward free papers, or take such steps as they might consider proper to secure my release. He promised to do so, but dwelt upon the danger of such an act in case of detection, and now impressed upon me the great necessity of strict silence and secrecy. Before we parted, our plan of operation was arranged. We agreed to meet the next night at a specified place among the high weeds on the bank of the bayou, some distance from Master's dwelling. There he was to write down on paper the names and address of several persons, old friends in the North, to whom he 272-12 takes a slave. Would direct letters during his next visit to Marksville. It was not deemed prudent to meet in the new house, inasmuch as the light it would be necessary to use might possibly be discovered. In the course of the day I managed to obtain a few matches and a piece of candle, unperceived, from the kitchen, during a temporary absence of Aunt Phoebe. Base had pencil and paper in his tool chest. At the appointed hour we met on the bayou bank, and creeping among the high weeds, I lighted the candle, while he drew forth pencil and paper and prepared for business. I gave him the names of William Perry, Cephas Parker, and Judge Marvin, all of Saratoga Springs, Saratoga County, New York. I had been employed by the latter in the United States Hotel, and had transacted business with the former to a considerable extent, and trusted that at least one of them would be still living at that place. He carefully wrote the names, and then remarked, thoughtfully, "It is so many years since you left Saratoga, all these men may be dead, or may have removed. You say you obtained papers at the Custom House in Is2 York. Probably there is a record of them there, and I think it would be well to write and ascertain." I agreed with him, and again repeated the circumstances related heretofore, connected with my visit to the Custom House with Brown and Hamilton. We lingered on the bank of the bayou an hour or more, conversing upon the subject which now engrossed our my faith M. Base, 273. Thoughts. I could no longer doubt his fidelity, and freely spoke to him of the many sorrows I had borne in silence, and so long. I spoke of my wife and children, mentioning their names and ages, and dwelling upon the unspeakable happiness it would be to clasp them to my heart once more before I died. I caught him by the hand, and with tears and passionate entreaties implored him to befriend me, to restore me to my kindred and to liberty, promising I would weary heaven the remainder of my life with prayers that it would bless and prosper him. In the enjoyment of freedom surrounded by the associations of youth, and restored to the bosom of my family that promise is not yet forgotten, nor shall it ever be so long as I have strength to raise my imploring eyes on high. Oh, blessings on his kindly voice and on his silver hair, and blessings on his whole life long, until he meet me there. He overwhelmed me with assurances of friendship and faithfulness, saying he had never before taken so deep an interest in the fate of any one. He spoke of himself in a somewhat mournful tone, as a lonely man, a wanderer about the world, that he was growing old, and must soon reach the end of his earthly journey, and lie down to his final rest without kith or kin to mourn for him, or to remember him, that his life was of little value to himself, and henceforth should be devoted to the accomplishment of my liberty, and to an unceasing warfare against the accursed shame of slavery. L**NA. 74 pounds 12 years a slave. After this time we seldom spoke to, or recognized each other. He was, moreover, less free in his conversation with Epps on the subject of slavery. The remotest suspicion that there was any unusual intimacy, any secret understanding between us never once entered the mind of Epps, or any other person, white or black, on the plantation. I am often asked, with an air of incredulity, how I succeeded so many years in keeping from my daily and constant companions the knowledge of my true name and history. The terrible lesson Birch taught me, impressed indelibly upon my mind the danger and uselessness of asserting I was a freeman. There was no possibility of any slave being able to assist me, while, on the other hand, there was a possibility of his exposing me. When it is recollected the whole current of my thoughts, for 12 years, turned to the contemplation of escape, it will not be wondered at, that I was always cautious and on my guard. It would have been an act of folly to have proclaimed my right to freedom. It would only have subjected me to severer scrutiny, probably have consigned me to some more distant and inaccessible region than even Bayou Surf. Edwin Epps was a person utterly regardless of a black man's rights or wrongs, utterly destitute of any natural sense of justice, as one well knew. It was important, therefore, not only as regarded my hope of deliverance, but also as regarded the few personal privileges I was permitted to enjoy, to keep from him the history of my life. Letter to P. Ajstpike. 2T5. The Saturday night subsequent to our interview at the water's edge, Base went home to Marksville. The next day, being Sunday, he employed himself in his own room writing letters. One he directed to the Collector of Customs at J. Yuk, another to Judge Marvin, and another to Messrs. Parker and Perry jointly. The latter was the one which led to my recovery. He subscribed my true name, but in the postscript intimated I was not the writer. The letter itself shows that he considered himself engaged in a dangerous undertaking, no less than running the risk of his life, if detected. I did not see the letter before it was mailed, but have since obtained a copy, which is here inserted. Bayou Burf, August 15, 1852. Mr. William Perry or Mr. Cephas Parker. Gentlemen, it having been a long time since I have seen or heard from you, and not knowing that you are living, it is with uncertainty that I write to you, but the necessity of the case must be my excuse. Having been born free, just across the river from you, I am certain you must know me, and I am here now a slave. I wish you to obtain free papers for me, and forward them to me at Marksville, Louisiana, parish of Avoyelles, and oblige. Yours, Solomon Northup. The way I came to be a slave, I was taken sick in Washington City, and was insensible for some time. When I recovered my reason, I was robbed of my free papers, and in irons on my way to this state, and have never been able to get any one to write for me until now, and he that is writing for me runs the risk of his life if detected. 276 12 years a slave. The allusion to myself in the work recently issued, entitled, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, contains the first part of this letter, omitting the postscript. Any either are the full names of the gentlemen to whom it is directed correctly stated, there being a slight discrepancy, probably a typographical error. To the postscript more than to the body of the communication am I indebted for my liberation, as will presently be seen. When Base returned from Marksville he informed me of what he had done. We continued our midnight consultations, never speaking to each other through the day, excepting as it was necessary about the work. As nearly as he was able to ascertain, it would require 2 weeks for the letter to reach Saratoga in due course of mail, and the same length of time for an answer to return. Within 6 weeks, at the farthest, we concluded, an answer would arrive, if it arrived at all. A great many suggestions were now made, and a great deal of conversation took place between us, as to the most safe and proper course to pursue on receipt of the free papers. They would stand between him and harm, in case we were overtaken and arrested leaving the country altogether. It would be no infringement of law, however much it might provoke individual hostility, to assist a freeman to regain his freedom. At the end of 4 weeks he was again at Marksville, but no answer had arrived. I was sorely disappointed, but still reconciled myself with the reflection. Base ex devos to cheer me 277. That sufficient length of time had not yet elapsed that there might have been delays and that I could not reasonably expect one so soon. 6, 7, 8, and 10 weeks passed by, however, and nothing came. I was in a fever of suspense whenever Base visited Marksville, and could scarcely close my eyes until his return. Finally my master's house was finished, and the time came when Base must leave me. The night before his departure I was wholly given up to despair. I had clung to him as a drowning man clings to the floating spar, knowing if it slips from his grasp he must forever sink beneath the waves. The all-glorious hope, upon which I had laid such eager hold, was crumbling to ashes in my hands. I felt as if sinking down, amidst the bitter waters of slavery, from the unfathomable depths of which I should never rise again. The generous heart of my friend and benefactor was touched with pity at the sight of my distress. He endeavored to cheer me up, promising to return the day before Christmas, and if no intelligence was received in the meantime, some further step would be undertaken to effect our design. He exhorted me to keep up my spirits, to rely upon his continued efforts in my behalf, assuring me, in most earnest and impressive language, that my liberation should, from thenceforth, be the chief object of his thoughts. In his absence the time passed slowly indeed. I looked forward to Christmas with intense anxiety and impatience. I had about given up the expectation of 278 12 years a slave. Receiving any answer to the letters. They might have miscarried, or might have been misdirected. Perhaps those at Saratoga, to whom they had been addressed, were all dead, perhaps, engaged in their pursuits. They did not consider the fate of an obscure, unhappy black man of sufficient importance to be noticed. My whole reliance was in Base. The faith I had in him was continually reassuring me, and enabled me to stand up against the tide of disappointment that had overwhelmed me. So wholly was I absorbed in reflecting upon my situation and prospects, that the hands with whom I labored in the field often observed it. Patsy would ask me if I was sick, and Uncle Abram and Bob and Wiley frequently expressed a curiosity to know what I could be thinking about so steadily. But I evaded their inquiries with some light remark, and kept my thoughts locked closely in my breast. Chapter 20. Base faithful to his word. His arrival on Christmas Eve. The difficulty of obtaining an interview. The meeting in the cabin. Non-arrival of the letter. Base announces his intention to proceed north. Christmas conversation between Epps and Base. Young Mistress Mcoy, the beauty of Bayou Surf. The NE+. Ultra of dinners. Music and dancing. Presence of the mistress. Her exceeding beauty. The last slave dance. William Pierce. Oversleep myself. The last whipping. Despondency. The cold morning. Epps threats the passing carriage. Strangers. AP crouching through the cotton field. Last hour on Bayou Surf. Faithful to his word, the day before Christmas, just at nightfall, Base came riding into the yard. "How are you?" said Epps, shaking him by the hand. "Glad to see you." He would not have been very glad had he known the object of his errand. Quite well," answered Base. "Had some business out on the bayou, and concluded to call and see you, and stay overnight." Epps ordered one of the slaves to take charge of his horse, and with much talk and laughter they passed into the house together, not, however, until Base bad looked at me significantly, as much as to say, 2S012 Tia is a slave. Keep dark, we understand each other." It was 10 o'clock at night before the labors of the day were performed, when I entered the cabin. At that time Uncle Abram and Bob occupied it with me. I laid down upon my board and feigned I was asleep. When my companions had fallen into a profound slumber, I moved stealthily out of the door, and watched, and listened attentively for some sign or sound from Base. There I stood until long after midnight, but nothing could be seen or heard. As I suspected, he dared not leave the house, through fear of exciting the suspicion of some of the family. I judged, correct why, he would rise earlier than was his custom, and take the opportunity of seeing me before Epps was up. Accordingly I aroused Uncle Abram and Horn sooner than usual, and sent him into the house to build a fire, which, at that season of the year, is a part of Uncle Abram's duties. I also gave Bob a violent shake, and asked him if he intended to sleep till noon, saying master would be up before the mules were fed. He knew right well the consequence that would follow such an event, and, jumping to his feet, was at the horse pasture in a twinkling. Presently, when both were gone, Base slipped into the cabin. "No letter yet, Piot," said he. The announcement fell upon my heart like lead. "Oh, do write again, Master Base," I cried. "I will give you the names of a great many I know." The meeting in the cabin. 281. Surely they are not all dead. Surely someone will pity me. "Sto use," Base replied, "no use. I have made up my mind to that. I fear the Marksville postmaster will mistrust something, I have inquired so often at his office. Too uncertain, too dangerous." "Then it is all over," I exclaimed. "Oh, my God, how can I end my days here?" "You're not going to end them here," he said, "unless you die very soon. I've thought this matter all over, and have come to a determination. There are more ways than one to manage this business, and a better and surer way than writing letters. I have a job or two on hand which can be completed by March or April. By that time I shall have a considerable sum of money, and then, Piot, I am going to Saratoga myself." I could scarcely credit my own senses as the words fell from his lips. But he assured me, in a manner that left no doubt of the sincerity of his intention, that if his life was spared until spring, he should certainly undertake the journey. "I have lived in this region long enough," he continued, "I may as well be in one place as another. For a long time I have been thinking of going back once more to the place where I was born. I'm tired of slavery as well as you. If I can succeed in getting you away from here, it will be a good act that I shall like to think of all my life. And I shall succeed. 282 12 years a slave. Piot, I'm hound to do it. Now let me tell you what I want. Epps will be up soon, and it won't do to be caught here. Think of a great many men at Saratoga and Sandy Hill, and in that neighborhood, who once knew you. I shall make excuse to come here again in the course of the winter, when I will write down their names. I will then know who to call on when I go north. Think of all you can. Cheer up. Don't be discouraged. I'm with you, life or death. Goodbye. God bless you," and saying this he left the cabin quickly, and entered the great house. It was Christmas morning, the happiest day in the whole year for the slave. That morning he need not hurry to the field, with his gourd and cotton bag. Happiness sparkled in the eyes and overspread the countenances of all. The time of feasting and dancing had come. The cane and cotton fields were deserted. That day the clean dress was registered beyond the red ribbon displayed, there were to be reunions, and joy and laughter, and hurrying to and fro. It was to be a day of liberty among the children of slavery. Wherefore they were happy, and rejoiced. After breakfast Epps and Base sauntered about the yard, conversing upon the price of cotton, and various other topics. "Where do your niggers hold Christmas?" Base inquired. "Piot is going to Tanner's today. His fiddle is in great demand. They want him at Marshall's Mon. ERPS Covexidin with Base. 283. Day, and Miss Myee McCoy, on Old Norwood Plantation, writes me a note that she wants him to play for her niggers Tuesday. He is rather a smart boy, ain't he?" said Base. "Come here, Piot," he added, looking at me as I walked up to them, as if he had never thought before to take any special notice of me. "Yes," replied Epps, taking hold of my arm and feeling it, "there isn't a bad joint in him. There ain't a boy on the bayou worth more than he is perfectly sound, and no bad tricks. DN him, he isn't like other niggers, doesn't look like don't act like I was offered $1,700 for him last week." "And didn't take it?" Base inquired, with an air of surprise. "Take it no, devilish clear of it. Why, he's a reg'lar genius, can make a plow beam, wagon tongue anything, as well as you can. Marshall wanted to put up one of his niggers agin him and RAFFLE for them, but I told him I would see the devil have him first." "I don't see anything remarkable about him," Base observed. "Why, just feel of him, now," Epps rejoined. "You don't see a boy very often put together any closer than he is. He's a thin-skinned cuss, and won't bear as much whipping as some, but he's got the muscle in him, and no mistake." Base felt of me, turned me round, and made a 284, 12 teaks a slave. Thorough examination, Epps all the while dwelling on my good points. But his visitor seemed to take but little interest finally in the subject, and consequently it was dropped. Base soon departed, giving me another sly look of recognition and significance, as he trotted out of the yard. When he was gone I obtained a pass, and started for Tanner's, not Peter Tanner's, of whom mention has previously been made, but a relative of his. I played during the day and most of the night, spending the next day, Sunday, in my cabin. Monday I crossed the bayou to Douglas Marshall's, all Epps slaves accompanying me, and on Tuesday went to the old Norwood place, which is the third plantation above Marshall's, on the same side of the water. This estate is now owned H.J. Miss Mary McCoy, a lovely girl, some 20 years of age. She is the bow tie and the glory of bayou surf. She owns about 100 working hands, besides a great many house servants, yard boys, and young children. Her brother-in-law, who resides on the adjoining estate, is her general agent. She is beloved by all her slaves, and good reason indeed have they to be thankful that they have fallen into such gentle hands. Nowhere on the bayou are there such feasts, such merry-making, as at young Madam McCoy's. Thither, more than to any other place, do the old and the young for miles around love to repair in the time of the Christmas holidays, for nowhere else can they find such delicious repasts, nowhere else can they hear a voice speaking to them. Christmas Dinner 285. Bow pleasantly. Isto one is so well beloved, no one fills so large a space in the hearts of 1,000 slaves, as young Madam McCoy, the orphan mistress of the old Norwood estate. On my arrival at her place, I found 200 or 300 had assembled. The table was prepared in a long building, which she had erected expressly for her slaves to dance in. It was covered with every variety of food the country afforded, and was pronounced by general acclamation to be the rarest of dinners. Roast turkey, pig, chicken, duck, and all kinds of meat, baked, boiled, and broiled, formed a line the whole length of the extended table, while the vacant spaces were filled with tarts, jellies, and frosted cake, and pastry of many kinds. The young mistress walked around the table, smiling and saying a kind word to each one, and seemed to enjoy the scene exceedingly. When the dinner was over the tables were removed to make room for the dancers. I tuned my violin and struck up a lively air, while some joined in a nimble reel, others patted and sang their simple but melodious songs, filling the great room with music mingled with the sound of human voices and the clatter of many feet. In the evening the mistress returned, and stood in the door a long time, looking at us. She was magnificently arrayed, her dark hair and eyes contrasted strongly with her clear and delicate complexion. Her form was slender but commanding, and her 286-12 tia as a slave movement was a combination of unaffected dignity and grace. As she stood there, clad in her rich apparel, her face animated with pleasure, I thought I had never looked upon a human being half so beautiful. I dwell with delight upon the description of this fair and gentle lady, not only because she inspired me with emotions of gratitude and admiration, but because I would have the reader understand that all slave owners on Bayou Surf are not like Epps, or Tibeats, or Jim Burns. Occasionally can be found, rarely it may be, indeed, a good man like William Ford, or an angel of kindness like young Mistress McCoy. Tuesday concluded the 3 holidays Epps yearly allowed us. On my way home, Wednesday morning, while passing the plantation of William Pierce, that gentleman hailed me, saying he had received a line from Epps, brought down by William Yarnell, permitting him to detain me for the purpose of playing for his slaves that night. It was the last time I was destined to witness a slave dance on the shores of Bayou Surf. The party at Pierce's continued their jollification until broad daylight, when I returned to my master's house, somewhat wearied with the loss of rest, but rejoicing in the possession of numerous bits and picayunes, which the whites, who were pleased with my musical performances, had contributed. On Saturday morning, for the first time in years, I overslept myself. I was frightened on coming out of the cabin to find the slaves were already in the field. The last whipping. 287. They had preceded me some 15 minutes. Leaving my dinner and water gourd, I hurried after them as fast as I could move. It was not yet sunrise, but Epps was on the piazza as I left the hut, and cried out to me that it was a pretty time of day to be getting up. By extra exertion my row was up when he came out after breakfast. This, however, was no excuse for the offense of oversleeping. Bidding me strip and lie down, he gave me 10 or 15 lashes, at the conclusion of which he inquired if I thought, after that, I could get up sometime in the morning. I expressed myself quite positively that I could, and, with back stinging with pain, went about my work. The following day, Sunday, my thoughts were upon Bass, and the probabilities and hopes which hung upon his action and determination. I considered the uncertainty of life, that if it should be the will of God that he should die, my prospect of deliverance, and all expectation of happiness in this world, would be wholly ended and destroyed. My sore back, perhaps, did not have a tendency to render me unusually cheerful. I felt downhearted and unhappy all day long, and when I laid down upon the hard board at night, my heart was oppressed with such a load of grief, it seemed that it must break. Monday morning, the 3rd of January, 1853, we were in the field betimes. It was a raw, cold morning, such as is unusual in that region. I was in advance, Uncle Abram next to me, behind him Bob, Patsy and Wiley, with our cotton bags about our 288 12 tiers a slave necks. Epps happened, a rare thing, indeed, to come out that morning without his whip. He swore, in a manner that would shame a pirate, that we were doing nothing. Bob ventured to say that his fingers were so numb with cold he couldn't pick fast. Epps cursed himself for not having brought his rawhide, and declared that when he came out again he would warm us well, yes, he would make us all hotter than that fiery realm in which I am sometimes compelled to believe he will himself eventually reside. With these fervent expressions, he left us. When out of hearing, we commenced talking to each other, saying how hard it was to be compelled to keep up our tasks with numb fingers, how unreasonable master was, and speaking of him generally in no flattering terms. Our conversation was interrupted by a carriage passing rapidly towards the house. Looking up, we saw 2 men approaching us through the cotton field. Having now brought down this narrative to the last hour I was to spend on Bayou Bzurf, having got 10 through my last cotton picking, and about to bid Master Epps farewell, I must beg the reader to go back with me to the month of August, to follow Base Letter on its long journey to Saratoga, to learn the effect it produced, and that, while I was repining and despairing in the slave hut of Edwin Epps, through the friendship of Base and the goodness of Providence, all things were working together for my deliverance. Chapter 21. The letter reaches Saratoga, is forwarded to and is laid before Henry B. Northup. The statute of May 14, 1840, its provisions ends memorial to the governor, the affidavits AC accompanying it, Senator Soul's letter, departure of the agent appointed by the governor, arrival at Marksville, the Hon. John P. Waddell. The conversation on New York politics, it suggests a fortunate idea, the meeting with Base, the secret out legal proceedings instituted, departure of Northup and the sheriff from Marksville for Bayou Bzurf, arrangements on the way, reach Epps' plantation, discover his slaves in the cotton field, the meeting, the farewell. I am indebted to Mr. Henry B. Northup/P. and Auth. ERS for many of the particulars contained in this chapter. The letter written by Base, directed to Parker and Perry, and which was deposited in the post office in Marksville on the 15th day of August, 1852, arrived at Saratoga in the early part of September. Some time previous to this, Anne had removed to Glens Falls, Warren County, where she had charge of the kitchen in Carpenter's Hotel. She kept house, however, lodging with our children, and was only absent from them during such time as the discharge of her duties in the hotel required. MID. 290 12 years a slate. Messrs. Parker and Perry, on receipt of the letter, forwarded it immediately to Anne. On reading it, the children were all excitement, and without delay hastened to the neighboring village of Sandy Hill, to consult Henry B. J. Northup, and obtain his advice and assistance in the matter. Upon examination, that gentleman found among the statutes of the state an act providing for the recovery of free citizens from slavery. It was passed May 14, 1840, and is entitled, An Act more effectually to protect the free citizens of this state from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery. It provides that it shall be the duty of the governor, upon the receipt of satisfactory information that any free citizen or inhabitant of this state is wrongfully held in another state or territory of the United States, upon the allegation or pretense that such person is a slave, or by color of any usage or rule of law is deemed or taken to be a slave, to take such measures to procure the restoration of such person to liberty, as he shall deem necessary. And to that end, he is authorized to appoint and employ an agent, and directed to furnish him with such credentials and instructions as will be likely to accomplish the object of his appointment. It requires the agent so appointed to proceed to collect the proper proof to establish the right of such person to his freedom, to perform such journeys, take such measures, institute such legal proceedings, and c. as may be necessary to return such person to this state, and charges all expenses incurred in carrying. Anne's memo to the Governor. 291. The act into effect, upon monies not otherwise appropriated in the treasury *. It was necessary to establish two facts to the satisfaction of the governor: first, that I was a free citizen of New York, and secondly, that I was wrongfully held in bondage. As to the first point, there was no difficulty, all the older inhabitants in the sixth vicinity being ready to testify to it. The second point rested entirely upon the letter to Parker and Perry, written in an unknown hand, and upon the letter pen net on board the brig Orleans, which, unfortunately, had been mislaid or lost. A memorial was prepared, directed to His Excellency, Governor Hunt, setting forth her marriage, my departure to Washington City, the receipt of the letters, that I was a free citizen, and such other facts as were deemed important, and was signed and verified by Anne. Accompanying this memorial were several affidavits of prominent citizens of Sandy Hill and Fort Edward, corroborating fully the statements it contained, and also a request of several well-known gentlemen to the governor, that Henry B.I.S. Northup be appointed agent under the Legislative Act. On reading the memorial and affidavits, His Excellency took a lively interest in the matter, and on the 23rd day of November, 1852, under the seal of the state, constituted, appointed and employed Henry B.S. Northup, Esq., an agent, with full power to effect my restoration, and to take such measures as would. See Appendix A. 292-12 Tia as a slave. Be most likely to accomplish it, and instructing him to proceed to Louisiana with all convenient dispatch *. The pressing nature of Mr. Northup's professional and political engagements delayed his departure until December. On the 14th day of that month he left Sandy Hill, and proceeded to Washington. The Honorable Pierre Soule, Senator in Congress from Louisiana, Honorable Mr. Conrad, Secretary of War, and Judge Nelson, of the Supreme Court of the United States, upon hearing a statement of the facts, and examining his commission, and certified copies of the memorial and affidavits, furnished him with open letters to gentlemen in Louisiana, strongly urging their assistance in accomplishing the object of his appointment. Senator Soule especially interested himself in the matter, insisting, in forcible language, that it was the duty and interest of every planter in his state to aid in restoring me to freedom, and trusted the sentiments of honor and justice in the bosom of every citizen of the Commonwealth would enlist him at once in RNY behalf. Having obtained these valuable letters, Mr. K. Northup returned to Baltimore, and proceeded from thence to Pittsburgh. It was his original intention, under advice of friends at Washington, to go directly to New Orleans, and consult the authorities of that city. Providentially, however, on arriving at the mouth of Piver, he changed his mind. Had he continued on, he would not have met with base, in *. See Appendix B. Arrival at Marksville. 293. Which case the search for Nye would probably have been fruitless. Taking passage on the first steamer that arrived, he pursued his journey up Red River, a sluggish, winding stream, flowing through a vast region of primitive forests and impenetrable swamps, almost wholly destitute of inhabitants. About 9 o'clock in the forenoon, January 1, 1853, he left the steamboat at Marksville, and proceeded directly to Marksville Courthouse, a small village 4 miles in the interior. From the fact that the letter to Messrs. Parker and Perry was postmarked at Marksville, it was supposed by him that I was in that place or its immediate vicinity. On reaching this town, he at once laid his business before the Honorable John P. Waddell, a legal gentleman of distinction, and a man of fine genius and most noble impulses. After reading the letters and documents presented him, and listening to a representation of the circumstances under which I had been carried away into captivity, Mr. Waddell at once proffered his services, and entered into the affair with great zeal and earnestness. He, in common with others of like elevated character, looked upon the kidnapper with abhorrence. The title of his fellow parishioners and clients to the property which constituted the larger proportion of their wealth, not only depended upon the good faith in which slave sales were transacted, but he was a man in whose honorable heart emotions of indignation were aroused by such an instance of injustice. 294-12 Teeks Slate. Marksville, although occupying a prominent position, and standing out in impressive italics on the map of Louisiana, is, in fact, but a small and insignificant hamlet. Aside from the tavern, kept by a jolly and generous Boniface, the courthouse, inhabited by lawless cows and swine in the seasons of vacation, and a high gallows, with its dissevered rope dangling in the air, there is little to attract the attention of the stranger. Solomon I.S. Northup was a name Mr. T. Waddell FLB never heard, but he was confident that if there was a slave bearing that appellation in Marksville or Sixcinity, his black boy Tom would know him. Tom was accordingly called, but in all his extensive circle of acquaintances there was no such personage. The letter to Parker and Perry was dated at Bayou Surf. At this place, therefore, the conclusion was, I must be sought. But here a difficulty suggested itself, of a very grave character indeed. Bayou Surf, at its nearest point, was 23 miles distant, and was the name applied to the section of country extending between 50 and 100 miles, on both sides of that stream. Thousands and thousands of slaves resided upon its shores, the remarkable richness and fertility of the soil having attracted thither a great number of planters. The information in the letter was so vague and indefinite as to render it difficult to conclude upon any specific course of proceeding. It was finally determined, however, as the only plan that presented any prospect of success. 3. New York Politics. 295. That Northup and the brother of Waddell, a student in the office of the latter, should repair to the bayou, and traveling up one side and down the other its whole length, inquire at each plantation for me. Mr. Waddell tendered the use of his carriage, and it was definitely arranged that they should start upon the excursion early Monday morning. It will be seen at once that this course, in all probability, would have resulted unsuccessfully. It would have been impossible for them to have gone into the fields and examine all the gangs at work. They were not aware that I was known only as Piatt, and had they inquired of Epps himself, he would have stated truly that he knew nothing of Solomon T. Northup. The arrangement being adopted, however, there was nothing further to be done until Sunday had elapsed. The conversation between Messrs. Northup and Waddell, in the course of the afternoon, turned upon New York politics. I can scarcely comprehend the nice distinctions and shades of political parties in your state, observed Mr. Waddell. I read of soft shells and hard shells, hunkers and barn burners, woolly heads and silver greys, and am unable to understand the precise difference between them. Pray, what is it? Mr. Northup, refilling his pipe, entered into quite an elaborate narrative of the origin of the various sections of parties, and concluded by saying there was another party in East New York, known as Free Soilers or 296 12 years a slate. Abolitionists. You have seen none of those in this part of the country, I presume. Mr. Northup remarked. Never, but one, answered Waddell, laughingly. We have one here in Marksville, an eccentric creature, who preaches abolitionism as vehemently as any fanatic at the North. He is a generous, inoffensive man, but always maintaining the wrong side of an argument. It affords us a deal of amusement. He is an excellent mechanic, and almost indispensable in this community. He is a carpenter. His name is Bass. Some further good-natured conversation was had at the expense of Bass' peculiarities, when Waddell all at once fell into a reflective mood, and asked for the mysterious letter again. Let me see one etmese, he repeated, thoughtfully to himself, running his eyes over the letter once more. Bayou Surf, August 15. August 15th postmarked here. He that is writing for me, where did Bass work last summer? He inquired, turning suddenly to his brother. His brother was unable to inform him, but rising, left the office, and soon returned with the intelligence that Bass worked last summer somewhere on Bayou Surf. He is the man, bringing down his hand emphatically on the table, who can tell us all about Solomon Northup, exclaimed Waddell. Bass was immediately searched for, but could not be found. After some inquiry, it was ascertained the meeting with Bass. 297. Was at the landing on Red River. Procuring a conveyance, young T. Waddell and Northup were not long in traversing the few miles to the latter place. On their arrival, Bass was found, just on the point of leaving, to be absent a fortnight or more. After an introduction, Northup begged the privilege of speaking to him privately a moment. They walked together towards the river, when the following conversation ensued. Mr. Bass, said Northup, allow me to ask you if you were on Bayou Surf last August. Sir, I was there in August, was the reply. Did you write a letter for a colored man at that place to some gentleman in Saratoga Springs? Excuse me, sir, if I say that is none of your busy equals-ness, answered Bass, stopping and looking his interrogator searchingly in the face. Perhaps I am rather hasty, Mr. Bass, I beg your pardon, but I have come from the state of New York to accomplish the purpose the writer of a letter dated the 15th of August, postmarked at Marksville, had in view. Circumstances have led me to think that you are perhaps the man who wrote it. I am in search of Solomon Northup. If you know him, I beg you to inform me frankly where he is, and I assure you the source of any information you may give me shall not be divulged, if you desire it not to be. A long-time base looked his new acquaintance steadily in the eyes, without opening his lips. He seemed to be doubting in his own mind if there was *298 12 years a slave. Not an attempt to practice some deception upon him. Finally he said, deliberately, I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I am the man who wrote the letter. If you have come to rescue Solomon Northup, I am glad to see you. When did you last see him, and where is he? Northup inquired. I last saw him Christmas, a week ago today. He is the slave of Edwin Epps, a planter on Bayou Boeuf, near Holmesville. He is not known as Solomon Northup, he is called Piot. The secret was out, the mystery was unraveled. Through the thick, black cloud, amid whose dark and dismal shadows I had walked 12 years, broke the star that was to light me back to liberty. All mistrust and hesitation were soon thrown aside, and the two men conversed long and freely upon the subject uppermost in their thoughts. Bass expressed the interest he had taken in my behalf, his intention of going north in the spring, and declaring that he had resolved to accomplish my emancipation, if it were in his power. He described the commencement and progress of his acquaintance with me, and listened with eager curiosity to the account given him of my family, and the history of my early life. Before separating, he drew a map of the bayou on a strip of paper with a piece of red chalk, showing the locality of Epps 5 plantation, and the road leading most directly to it. Northup and his young companion returned to Marksville, where it was determined to commence legal PEOCEEDMGS 299 legal proceedings to test the question of my right to freedom. I was made plaintiff, Mr. Northup acting as my guardian, and Edwin Epps defendant. The process to be issued was in the nature of a reply 7, direct to the sheriff of the parish, commanding him to take me into custody, and detain me until the decision of the court. By the time the papers were duly drawn up, it was 12 o'clock at night, too late to obtain the necessary signature of the judge, who resided some distance out of town. Further business was therefore suspended until Monday morning. Everything, apparently, was moving along swimmingly, until Sunday afternoon, when Waddell called at Northup's room to express his apprehension of difficulties they had not expected to encounter. Bass had become alarmed, and had placed his affairs in the hands of a person at the landing, communicating to him his intention of leaving the state. This person had betrayed the confidence reposed in him to a certain extent, and a rumor began to float about the town, that the stranger at the hotel, who had been observed in the company of lawyer Waddell, was after one of old Epps' slaves, over on the bayou. Epps was known at Marksville, having frequent occasion to visit that place during the session of the courts, and the fear entertained by Mr. Northup's adviser was, that intelligence would be conveyed to him in the night, giving him an opportunity of secreting me before the arrival of the sheriff. This apprehension had the effect of expediting Matt. 812 years a slave. Ters considerably. The sheriff, who lived in one direction from the village, was requested to hold himself in readiness immediately after midnight, while the judge was informed he would be called upon at the same time. It is but justice to say, that the authorities at Marksville cheerfully rendered all the assistance in their power. As soon after midnight as bail could be perfected, and the judge's signature obtained, a carriage, containing Mr. Northup and the sheriff, driven by the landlord's son, rolled rapidly out of the village of Marksville, on the road towards Bayou Boeuf. It was supposed that Epps would contest the issue involving my right to liberty, and it therefore suggested itself to Mr. J. Northup, that the testimony of the sheriff, describing my first meeting with the former, might perhaps become material on the trial. It was accordingly arranged during the ride, that, before I had an opportunity of speaking to Mr. Northup, the sheriff should propound to me certain questions agreed upon, such as the number and names of my children, the name of my wife before marriage, of places I knew at the north, and so forth. If my answers corresponded with the statements given him, the evidence must necessarily be considered conclusive. At length, shortly after Epps had left the field, with the consoling assurance that he would soon return and warm us, as was stated in the conclusion of the preceding chapter, they came in sight of the plantation. Reach Epps Plantation. 301. And discovered us at work. Alighting from the carriage, and directing the driver to proceed to the great house, with instructions not to mention to anyone the object of their errand until they met again, J.S. Northup and the sheriff turned from the highway, and came towards us across the cotton field. We observed them, on looking up at the carriage, one several rods in advance of the other. It was a singular and unusual thing to see white men approaching us in that manner, and especially at that early hour in the morning, and Uncle Abram and Patsy made some remarks, expressive of their astonishment. Walking up to Bob, the sheriff inquired, "Where's the boy they call Piatt?" "Thar he is, massa," answered Bob, pointing to me, and twitching off his hat. I wondered to myself what business he could possibly have with me, and turning round, gazed at him until he had approached within a step. During my long residence on the bayou, I had become familiar with the face of every planter within many miles, but this man was an utter stranger. Certainly I had never seen him before. "Your name is Piatt, is it?" he asked. "Yes, master," I responded. Pointing towards Northup, standing a few rods distant, he demanded, "Do you know that man?" I looked in the direction indicated, and as my eyes rested on his countenance, a world of images thronged my brain, a multitude of well-known faces and 302 tears a slave. And the dear children's, and my old dead father's, all the scenes and associations of childhood and youth, all the friends of other and happier days, appeared and disappeared, flitting and floating like dissolving shadows before the vision of my imagination, until at last the perfect memory of the man recurred to me, and throwing up my hands towards heaven, I exclaimed, in a voice louder than I could utter in a less exciting moment, "Henry B. Northup! Thank God, thank God!" In an instant I comprehended the nature of his busyness, and felt that the hour of my deliverance was at hand. I started towards him, but the sheriff stepped before me. "Stop a moment," said he, "have you any other name than Piatt?" "Solomon Northup is my name, master," I replied. "Have you a family too?" he inquired. "I had a wife and 3 children." "What were your children's names?" "Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo." "And your wife's name before her marriage?" "Ann Hampton." "Who married you?" "Timothy Eddy, of Fort Edward." "Where does that gentleman live?" again pointing to Northup, who remained standing in the same place where I had first recognized him. "He lives in Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York," was the reply. The meeting. 303. He was proceeding to ask further questions, but I pushed past him, unable longer to restrain myself. I seized my old acquaintance by both hands. I could not speak, I could not refrain from tears. "Soul," he said at length, "I'm glad to see you." I essayed to make some answer, but emotion choked all utterance, and I was silent. The slaves, utterly confounded, stood gazing upon the scene, their open mouths and rolling eyes indicating the utmost wonder and astonishment. For 10 years I had dwelt among them, in the field and in the cabin, borne the same hardships, partake in the same fare, mingled my griefs with theirs, participated in the same scanty joys. Nevertheless, not until this hour, the last I was to remain among them, had the remotest suspicion of my true name, or the slightest knowledge of my real history, been entertained by any one of them. Not a word was spoken for several minutes, during which time I clung fast to Northup, looking up into his face, fearful I should awake and find it all a dream. "Throw down that sack," Northup added, finally, "your cotton-picking days are over. Come with us to the man you live with." I obeyed him, and walking between him and the sheriff, we moved towards the great house. It was not until we had proceeded some distance that I had recovered my voice sufficiently to ask if my family were all living. He informed me he had seen Anne, Margaret, and Elizabeth but a short time previously. 304 tears a slave. That Alonzo was also living, and all were well. My mother, however, I could never see again. As I began to recover in some measure from the sudden and great excitement which so overwhelmed me, I grew faint and weak, insomuch it was with difficulty I could walk. The sheriff took hold of my arm and assisted me, or I think I should have fallen. As we entered the yard, Epps stood by the gate, conversing with the driver. That young man, faithful to his instructions, was entirely unable to give him the least information in answer to his repeated inquiries of what was going on. By the time we reached him he was almost as much amazed and puzzled as Bob or Uncle Abram. Shaking hands with the sheriff, and receiving an introduction to Mr. Northup, he invited them into the house, ordering me, at the same time, to bring in some wood. It was some time before I succeeded in cutting an armful, having, somehow, unaccountably, lost the power of wielding the axe with any manner of precision. When I entered with it at last, the table was strewn with papers, from one of which Northup was reading. I was probably longer than necessity required, in placing the sticks upon the fire, being particular as to the exact position of each individual one of them. I heard the words, the said Solomon is Northup, and, the deponent further says, and, free citizen of New York, repeated frequently, and from these expressions understood that the secret I had so long retained from Master and Mistress Epps, was finally developing. I lingered as long as Prue. Of J. Scene in the cotton field, Solomon delivered up. Meeting at Epps' house. 305. Dance permitted, and was about leaving the room, when Epps inquired. Piet, do you know this gentleman? Yes, master, I replied, I have known him as long as I can remember. Where does he live? He lives in New York. Did you ever live there? Yes, master, born and bred there. You was free, then. Now you nigger. He exclaimed, why did you not tell me that when I bought you %? Master Epps, I answered, in a somewhat different tone than the one in which I had been accustomed to address him, Master Epps, you did not take the trouble to ask me. Besides, I told one of my owners, the man that kidnapped me, that I was free, and was whipped almost to death for it. It seems there has been a letter written for you by somebody. Now, who is it? He demanded, authoritatively. I made no reply. I say, who wrote that letter? He demanded again. Perhaps I wrote it myself, I said. You haven't been to Marksville post office and hack before light, I know. He insisted upon my informing him, and I insisted I would not. He made many vehement threats against the man, whoever he might be, and intimated the bloody and savage vengeance he would wreak upon 306 12 years a slave. Him, when he found him out. His whole manner and language exhibited a feeling of anger towards the unknown person who had written for me, and of fretfulness at the idea of losing so much property. Addressing Mr. Northup, he swore if he had only had an hour's notice of his coming, he would have saved him the trouble of taking me back to New York, that he would have run me into the swamp, or some other place out of the way, where all the sheriffs on earth couldn't have found me. I walked out into the yard, and was entering the kitchen door, when something struck me in the back. Aunt Phoebe, emerging from the back door of the great house with a pan of potatoes, had thrown one of them with unnecessary violence, thereby giving me to understand that she wished to speak to me a moment confidentially. Running up to me, she whispered in my ear with great earnestness. Lora mighty, Piet. What do ye think? Dem 2 men come after ye. Heard em tell massa you free got wife and 3 children back thar where you come from. Go in wid em. Fool if ye don't wish I could go. And Aunt Phoebe ran on in this manner at a rapid rate. Presently Mistress Epps made her appearance in the kitchen. She said many things to me, and wondered why I had not told her who I was. She expressed her regret, complimenting me by saying she had rather lose any other servant on the plantation, had Patsy that day stood in my place, the measure. The fuel. 307. Of my mistress' joy would have overflowed. Now there was no one left who could mend a chair or a piece of furniture, no one who was of any use about the house, no one who could play for her on the violin, and Mistress Epps was actually affected to tears. Epps had called to Bob to bring up his saddle horse. The other slaves, also, overcoming their fear of the penalty, had left their work and come to the yard. They were standing behind the cabins, out of sight of Epps. They beckoned me to come to them, and with all the eagerness of curiosity, excited to the highest pitch, conversed with and questioned me. If I could repeat the exact words they uttered, with the same emphasis, if I could paint their several attitudes, and the expression of their countenances, it would be indeed an interesting picture. In their estimation, I had suddenly arisen to an immeasurable height, had become a being of immense importance. The legal papers having been served, and arrangements made with Epps to meet them the next day at Marksville, I asked Northup, and the sheriff entered the carriage to return to the latter place. As I was about mounting to the driver's seat, the sheriff said I ought to bid Mr. and Mrs. Epps goodbye. I ran back to the piazza where they were standing, and taking off my hat, said, "Goodbye, Mrs. "Goodbye, Piet," said Mrs. Epps, kindly. "Goodbye, master." "Ah. You nigger," muttered Epps, in a surly 308 ye a slave. Malicious tone of voice. "You needn't feel so cussed tickled, you ain't gone yet, I'll see about this business at Marksville tomorrow. I was only a nigger carrot and knew my place, but felt as strongly as if I had been a white man, that it would have been an inward comfort, had I dared to have given him a parting kick." On my way back to the carriage, Patsy ran from behind a cabin and threw her arms about my neck. "Oh, Pyatt," she cried, tears streaming down her face, "you're goin' to be free, you're goin' way off yonder where we'll never see ya anymore. You've saved me a good many whippins, Pyatt, I'm glad you're goin' to be free, but oh, de Lord, what'll become of me?" I disengaged myself from her, and entered the carriage. The driver cracked his whip and away we rolled. I looked back and saw Patsy, with drooping head, half reclining on the ground. Mrs. Epps was on the piazza, Uncle Abraham, and Bob, and Wiley, and Aunt Phoebe stood by the gate, gazing after me. I waved my hand, but the carriage turned a bend of the bayou, hiding them from my eyes forever. We stopped a moment at Carey's sugar house, where a great number of slaves were at work, such an establishment being a curiosity to a northern man. Epps dashed by us on horseback at full speed on the way, as we learned next day, to the Pine Woods, to see William Ford, who had brought me into the country. Deepest Tour HOMEWAPWD. 309. Tuesday, the 4th of January, Epps and his counsel, the Honorable H. Taylor, I.S. Northup, Waddell, the Judge A.